You stand in the heat of an Athenian summer. 430 BC. The stones beneath your feet burn, though they have no fire upon them. The air itself seems to thicken, vibrating with the buzzing of flies. And then, you hear the groan of doors opening, not of homes, but of the temples, within those sanctuaries of the gods, where votive offerings once shone. You now see bodies, stacked in rows, limbs entwined, mouths open as though they had all gasped their last prayer together. The bellies of the temples, once swollen with sacrifice and incense, are now crammed with the flesh of the dead. You do not walk alone. You are pulled into the stream of survivors who shuffle past the sacred precincts. Some avert their gaze, others stare, hollow-eyed, as if already dead while still breathing. The smell reaches you before the sight does. Thucydides himself wrote of it. The bodies of the dying were heaped together. The temples where they took refuge full of corpses of persons that had died there. The stench clings to your hair, to your skin, to the folds of your tunic, and no water, however cool, can wash it away. The hum of the city is not the hum of life. It is the humming of fever, the cries of the infected. You hear the crack of wood as funeral pyres, hastily lit, collapse beneath the weight of too many bodies. You see dogs circling the outskirts, lean with hunger, gnawing on human flesh abandoned when the relatives themselves fell ill. You remember how burial rites once anchored the city's honor. Now, men cast the bodies of kin onto strangers' pyres, desperate only to be rid of them, terrified that tomorrow the same fate awaits their own limbs. You do not belong to a later century. You are here, in Athens, in the second year of the Peloponnesian War. The Spartan enemy is camped in Attica, burning the fields. Yet it is not the spear that terrifies you. It is the invisible hand that grips lungs, twists bowels, and burns the body with fire from within. It is the plague, striking without mercy, spreading among the crowded walls where refugees have fled behind Athens' long walls. The great democracy, proud and radiant, finds itself choking in its temples, its houses, its very breath, and you are a witness. The past is not dead. It is only waiting. If what you're about to witness leaves you unsettled or awakened, consider subscribing. Not for the numbers, but to help these buried stories rise again. If it brings value, leave a like. If it stays with you, leave silence. The year is 430 BC. Pericles still leads Athens, though already grief will hollow him. The war with Sparta had promised glory, but it is disease that delivers ruin. According to Thucydides, who himself survived, the plague began in Piraeus, the port of Athens, and spread quickly into the city. It struck men, women, children, foreigners, slaves, generals, and priests alike. Physicians, the first to face the sick, died in greater numbers than most. The disease was relentless, beginning with sudden fevers, redness of the eyes, throats inflamed, and breath foul-smelling. Many vomited bile, seized by spasms. Ulcers covered the body, while unquenchable thirst drove men to plunge themselves into cold water, only to die gasping in the fountains. There was no escape. The crowded city, swollen with refugees from the countryside, became the perfect cage. The long walls that once promised safety now served as prison bars for pestilence. Families dissolved, customs collapsed. Thucydides wrote of how men now did just what they pleased, coolly venturing on what they had formerly done only in a corner. Seeing the sudden change, how the rich died in a moment and those who had nothing immediately inherited their property. Fear unbound the city from its moral anchors. Some gave themselves to excess, feasting amid corpses. Others lay abandoned, denied even water, because no friend dared to approach. Pericles, once a statesman of measured voice and unmatched authority, watched his sons carried to their graves. He himself would soon die, though whether of the plague or exhaustion remains debated. Athens, the jewel of Greece, Its theaters and temples once radiant, was silenced by coughing, groaning, the collapse of funeral pyres too burdened to burn. This is the story you now remember, not as a tourist, but as a witness, and it begins where all horror begins, with a single door opening, and the sight of a sacred temple packed not with gods, but with corpses. The first wave, you remember when it first came, not with thunder, not with an omen in the sky, but with the whisper of rumors arriving by sea. Ships docked at Piraeus, the great harbor of Athens, carrying grain, soldiers, and merchants, and with them, invisible passengers. Thucydides tells you, it is said to have begun in Ethiopia, beyond Egypt. Thence it descended into Egypt and Libya and into much of the king's country. By the time the ships reached Athens, the city was already thick with refugees. War had driven the farmers of Attica behind the long walls, into a city never meant to hold so many souls at once. The crowded quarters were fertile soil for sickness. At first, it was dismissed. A fever here, a cough there. Physicians spoke of the heat of summer, of spoiled food. But soon, the pattern was unmistakable. The illness came suddenly, like an ambush. Men who had walked the marketplace at dawn collapsed before midday. Women who had prepared the morning's bread by the oven could not rise to serve it. The eyes reddened, inflamed, glowing as though lit by coals. The throat swelled, the tongue grew rough, and the breath became foul, as if the lungs themselves were rotting within the chest. You watched as neighbors gasped, their voices failing, replaced only by hoarse moans. The physicians were the first to perish. They leaned close to examine the sick, touched their skin, pressed their bellies, and in days, their own bodies were seized by the same torment. Thucydides notes this bitter irony, that those who tended the sick died in greater numbers than most, and that the helplessness of medicine only deepened despair. Remedies failed, sacrifices at the temples brought no relief, oracles gave no answers. Hope itself, that last medicine of the soul, began to wither. The symptoms spread in cruel order. A man would be struck with sudden heat, his head throbbing, eyes burning crimson, his throat and tongue inflamed, his breath fetid, his voice choking. Then came sneezing, hoarseness, pain in the chest, his stomach revolted, vomiting bile in violent convulsions. Soon, the body broke out in sores and ulcers, an external mirror of the corruption inside. The skin turned red, blistered, or livid. In some, the fingers and toes blackened. In others, the eyes grew blind. Most were seized by unquenchable thirst, so that they threw themselves into cisterns and fountains, desperate to drink, desperate to cool their burning blood. And there they died, floating in the water they had longed for. The order of the city began to crumble with the flesh of its citizens. At first, families tried to tend their sick. Mothers held children to their breasts even as fevers racked their own bodies. Sons carried fathers to the temples, begging the gods for mercy. But soon, the futility became clear. The contagion leapt from bed to bed, sparing neither the loving nor the dutiful. The very act of care was a death sentence. Fear divided families. The sick were abandoned in alleys, in porticos, even on temple steps. When they fell sick, Thucydides recalls, they tended to one another indiscriminately, and so they died like sheep. You saw it with your own eyes, an entire household silenced within a week. Doors barred from outside, the cries within slowly fading until only flies escaped through the cracks. Funerals, once solemn and ordered, now collapsed into chaos. The demand was too great. The traditional rites of washing, laying out the body, adorning it with garlands, and carrying it in procession, all were discarded in haste. Corpses piled faster than pyres could be built. Relatives, desperate, would cast their kin onto strangers' burning heaps. Some fought in the streets over funeral space, dragging bodies by the feet, seeking any fire to consume them. Others left their dead unburied, food for dogs and birds, until even the scavengers grew sick and perished. The city that had once prided itself on reverence for the dead now drowned in dishonor. The temples, sanctuaries of the gods, became tombs. Refugees fled there, believing the gods would shield them. But the plague followed them into the sacred spaces. One by one, they collapsed on the stone floors, coughing blood, clawing their own throats. The priests too fell, and no one dared enter to remove the bodies. So the temples swelled, their bellies full of corpses. You passed them often, the doors cracked open by swollen feet. The smell of rot rolling out like incense reversed. Flies swarmed where once had hung garlands. Silence settled, broken only by the faint shifting of decaying bodies. Athens' gods were surrounded not by hymns but by carrion. Piraeus, the harbor where it began, suffered worst, crowded with sailors, traders, dock workers, and refugees. The disease devoured entire blocks. Some believed the Peloponnesians had poisoned the wells. Others spoke of divine wrath. But no answer mattered. The reality was the same: fever, thirst, ulcers, death. The infection coursed through the veins of the city like fire through dry wood. And Athens, proud and defiant, discovered that walls of stone cannot keep out the unseen. You recall the summer heat pressing down, amplifying the stench. Corpses lay in streets, too numerous to bury. The living stepped over the dead, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. To pause was to risk catching the breath of one already doomed. In some places, dogs tore at abandoned limbs. In others, children sat beside their parents' corpses, too weak to move, waiting their turn. The soundscape of Athens changed. No longer the rhythm of commerce, the debates of the assembly, or the chants of festivals. Instead, coughing, retching, groans, the crackling of overloaded pyres, and the silence that follows when a household goes still forever. The psychological fabric tore as quickly as the physical. Men, certain they would soon die, cast aside laws, customs, and shame. Men now did just what they pleased. Thucydides writes, thinking they would not live long enough to be brought to trial. Wealth meant nothing. The rich died swiftly, their goods immediately seized by the nearest survivor. The poor feasted, clothed themselves in garments stripped from corpses, drank wine from looted cellars, and lay in houses abandoned by the dead. Life became a frenzy, for tomorrow promised nothing but fever and thirst. You saw neighbors who once prided themselves on dignity stumbling drunken through the streets, garlands still fresh on their heads, while corpses leaned against the walls behind them. The soldiers too were struck. Camps within the city thinned as fever claimed hoplite and rower alike. The war with Sparta continued outside, but within, the greater enemy was this plague. The Spartans, hearing of the devastation, withdrew from Attica, fearful the contagion might spread to their lines. Athens was left to burn itself from within. The irony was cruel. The very refuge the Athenians had sought by gathering inside their walls became the crucible of their destruction. Yet amid the despair, some survived, not all succumbed. Thucydides himself, stricken with fever, blind eyes, sores, thirst, recovered. Those who lived through the sickness gained immunity, a strange mark of fortune in a city of ruin. They alone could tend to the sick without fear, moving among corpses with impunity. But even survival bore scars: scarred skin, scarred sight, scarred memory. You too carry these scars, etched not only on flesh but on the mind. For once you have walked through temples swollen with corpses, you can never again see stone or altar without remembering. The first wave left Athens hollowed. Tens of thousands perished in that summer alone. No census could record them. No grave could contain them. Families vanished, names erased, and yet the city still breathed. Shallow and ragged, Pericles himself remained alive, watching the dream of Athenian greatness blacken under fever. He spoke to the assembly, urging courage, warning against surrender. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed grief. For his own sons had already been carried to the pyres, and his city's temples now held more dead than gods. You are there, standing in the shadow of the Acropolis, inhaling air heavy with the perfume of rot. The first wave has passed, but its memory does not. The streets are quieter now, yet lined with empty houses. The temples are sealed, their doors closed against the weight inside, and the fear that lingers is heavier than the stench. For you know this is only the beginning. The burning cart. You remember when the first carts began to roll through the streets. They were not the carts of merchants filled with figs, olives, or amphorae of oil. They were not the carts of masons stacked with marble. They were crude wooden wagons, hastily built, pulled by animals too thin, too weary, their hides streaked with sweat, and upon them, bodies. Bodies upon bodies, men, women, children. The cart creaked and groaned under their weight, wood straining as though it might splinter at any moment. The wheels left dark trails not only of dust but of fluids seeping from the dead. You cannot look away. You are there, walking behind one such cart. The summer air thick, the smell so acrid it burns your nostrils until tears stream down your face. The plague has advanced. The first wave that stunned Athens has not receded. It has spread, consuming more. Every quarter of the city echoes with groans. You hear the coughing from alleys, the retching from houses where curtains flap like death shrouds. The sound is not only human. Dogs howl at night, restless, their noses filled with scents of decay. Birds, once circling high, no longer wheel above the city. They too have vanished, or died, having fed upon the bodies. Nature itself recoils. Thucydides wrote, "Birds and beasts that prey upon human bodies either would not touch them, or died after tasting them." You remember seeing a dog collapse by a roadside, belly swollen from what it had devoured, flies already covering its eyes. The city feels cursed, abandoned by gods and nature alike. The carts move toward pyres. Funeral customs once marked Athenian pride, orderly processions, libations, prayers, laments sung by kin. But now, you see chaos. Pyres stand half-built, their wood too green, their pits shallow. Corpses pile faster than fires can consume them. A pyre blazes, but collapses under its load, sending half-burned limbs rolling into the dirt. Another cart arrives, more bodies dumped upon embers still smoldering, fat sizzling, sparks rising. The smell is unbearable. It is not wood alone that burns, but flesh, hair, bone. The smoke drifts through the streets, clinging to your clothes, sinking into your skin. When you breathe, it coats your throat with bitterness. You feel sick, though you live. Order is gone. Thucydides describes it plainly. The sacred rites which had hitherto been universally observed were now all thrown into confusion. And the dead were buried as each one found the means. You witness it. A family, desperate, dragging their kin to a pyre already burning with strangers. They hurl the body on, ignoring the protests of those who claimed the fire. A quarrel erupts, men grappling, until another cart arrives with more bodies, and the fight dissolves into exhaustion. Others, finding no pyre free, cast their kin upon any heap, or leave them in ditches, covering them hastily with dust. The dignity of Athens crumbles along with the flesh of its citizens. The carts do not stop. At night, their wheels still echo, creaking through narrow lanes. Sometimes the loads shift, and a limb falls into the street. Children step around it, their faces hollow, eyes already too old. The carts themselves seem alive, groaning, dripping, moving endlessly. You think of them as the city's veins, carrying away its lifeblood. But there is no healing at the end of this circulation, only fire, ash, and silence. The war continues beyond the walls. Sparta waits, watching, but within Athens, Discipline vanishes. Men act as though each day is their last. Because it may be. Some feast in houses looted from the dead, reclining on couches still stained with blood and vomit. They drink unmixed wine, garlands upon their heads, songs upon their lips, yet even in laughter, coughing seizes them, the song turns to gasps. The garland wilts in fever sweat. Others give themselves to lawlessness. Gold, once precious, lies abandoned, for who will live long enough to spend it? Slaves flee, no longer bound by fear of punishment. For masters lie dead in the dust. Sacred places are violated, temples filled with corpses, their altars stained with fluids not of sacrifice but of disease. The very idea of the gods seems to rot with the bodies in their sanctuaries. And yet, not all surrender to madness. Some remain to tend the sick. Those who have already endured the plague and survived. Immune, they move through the city like shades. Unafraid of touch or breath. They bring water, though more often they bring only company to the dying. Thucydides noted them, praising their courage, but you see also their weariness. Their faces are scarred, eyes hollow, bodies thin. They live, but each day they move among the dead. Their very survival a reminder of those lost. You wonder if it is a blessing or a curse. One memory lingers. The cart that burned without fire. You saw it in the market square. A wagon, piled high with corpses, left unattended in the sun. No pyre waited, no kin came. The bodies swelled, gases building, skin splitting. The heat of summer and the oils of flesh conspired. And then, without torch or spark, the cart ignited. Flames leapt upward, feeding hungrily. Fat fueling fire, bones crackling like dry wood. People gasped, some fled, others stared. The cart became its own pyre, a grotesque offering to no god. You remember the sound most, the hiss of burning fluids, the crack as skulls burst. It is a sound that will not leave you. The plague respects neither station nor fame. Generals fall as swiftly as slaves. Pericles himself, once unshaken, now walks draped in mourning. His sons already consumed by fever. You see him in the assembly, his voice still steady, urging perseverance against Sparta, yet his eyes are clouded, not only with grief but with the dull sheen of exhaustion. Even greatness cannot shield against this fire. Soon, Pericles too will die, leaving Athens adrift, leaderless in both war and plague. The carts grow fewer, not because the plague has ended, but because there are fewer left to carry them. Entire families vanish. Streets are silent where once merchants cried their wares. The agora, once the beating heart of Athens, is filled with ash, with flies, with the echo of empty footsteps. Temples remain shut, their doors barred, their bellies swollen with corpses none dare to remove. The smell drifts even into the hills. A pall that clings over the city, visible in the haze that hangs above rooftops. At night, the glow of pyres flickers across the skyline, like witchfires of an enemy within. You are there, in the midst of it. You walk past the carts, past the pyres, past the houses with doors shut tight. You feel the eyes of the dying on you as you pass. Eyes that pled for water, for company, for mercy. You cannot answer them all. No one can. The city is too full of cries, and too empty of hands. You breathe, you walk, you witness, and you know this. Athens, which once dreamed of ruling all Greece, is now ruled by fire, fever, and the endless creak of carts carrying its dead. The silent house. You remember when the noise of carts faded, when the cries that once filled the streets thinned into silence. At first, you thought it was relief, that perhaps the plague had passed. But then you entered the houses. Behind their closed doors, silence was not peace, it was death. The houses of Athens, once full of conversation, laughter, quarrels, song, were now sealed tombs, their doors barred, their windows shuttered, and when finally the neighbors dared to enter, What they found was not life preserved but life extinguished. Families lay as they had fallen. Fathers on couches, mouths open, mothers on floors, arms outstretched, children curled where they had slept, still clutching small toys or pieces of bread gone stale, all stilled, as if the house itself had been suffocated. Thucydides wrote of this horror. Whole families were suddenly swept away. And there was no one left to bury the dead. You see it yourself. You push open a door. Its hinge stiff with neglect. The air inside strikes you like a wall, thick with the sweet sick odor of bodies days gone. Flies rise in a buzzing cloud, disturbed by your presence. The floor is littered with cups, jugs overturned in desperation for water. Beds are stained dark with fluids. Dogs, locked in with their masters, whimper weakly or lie stiff, their ribs showing. Cats slink silently, eyes gleaming, scavengers now of what once fed them. You turn away, but the image fixes itself into your mind. You know you will see it again in another house. And another. Athens is a city of silent houses. You pass through the agora. The marketplace no longer rings with barter. Stalls stand empty, cloth awnings torn, tables bare. Where once fishmongers cried their wares, now bones lie gnawed by dogs. Where potters once shaped clay, shards scatter on the ground. The air smells not of olives and wine but of ash and decay. You hear no debate in the Stoa, no lectures from philosophers, no arguments of merchants, only the occasional cough, the shuffle of a survivor dragging feet heavy with fatigue. And often, no sound at all. The temples remain sealed, their sanctuaries, once full of song, now only hold corpses. You remember a particular day, when you passed the temple of Hephaestus. Its steps were deserted, its altar untouched, but the door was ajar, and inside you glimpsed the truth. Rows of bodies, piled against the columns, their skin blotched and blistered, their hands clawing the air even in death. The priest was gone, the sacrifices ended, the god of fire had been given fire of another kind. The smell was unbearable. You turned away, but the sight lingered like a shadow over your eyes. It was not only commoners who fell. The plague reached every stratum of the city. Aristocrats, generals, magistrates, all alike. You recall the death of Pericles' sons, carried out with little ceremony. Their father cloaked in grief yet still compelled to address the assembly. Even the leader himself, the orator who had guided Athens through its golden age, grew pale, his strength sapped. Soon he too would follow, leaving Athens adrift. Authority collapsed with him. Laws still stood on stone, but no one enforced them. Fear ruled, and fear is no ruler at all. The war continued beyond the walls, but within Athens the enemy was unseen. Refugees crowded into cramped quarters, wells dried with overuse, grain spoiled. The sick outnumbered the living. You recall one night when the lamps burned low and you heard coughing from every direction. A chorus of lungs, wheezing, choking, until one by one the voices fell silent. And then, only the night insects remained. Athens itself seemed to have been struck mute. Children wandered the streets, gaunt and wide-eyed. Some had no parents left. They lingered near fountains, too weak to beg, too afraid to speak. You saw one, a girl perhaps 6 years of age, sitting beside her mother's body. She stroked the hair, whispering words you could not hear, until at last she slumped forward, silent forever. No one came for them. No one could. The house became their grave. The silence was broken only by the collapse of pyres, the occasional scream of one struck suddenly by fever, or the clatter of pottery as a sick man reached for water and fell. Even the sea at Piraeus seemed quiet. Fewer ships arrived. Sailors feared the port, feared the plague that clung to the very air. Athens, once mistress of the Aegean, seemed deserted, her harbors echoing with emptiness. You remember the faces of those who survived, scarred, hollow, marked, Some were blind, the disease having taken their sight. Others bore lesions that never fully healed. Still others walked with limps, their joints twisted. Survival was no triumph. It was a sentence to carry memory. These survivors moved among the silent houses, searching for kin, for food, for anything. They scavenged not only goods but lives, joining with strangers, forming new bonds in a city where old ones had been cut by death. They spoke little. Their voices, too, seemed muted by the weight of what they had seen. Religion faltered. The oracles gave no guidance. Sacrifices ceased, not only because priests had died, but because faith itself rotted. Men and women no longer trusted the gods, for the temples reeked of corpses. Men ceased to fear the law of God and man alike. Thucydides wrote, alike regarding things pious and impious. You saw altars broken, idols neglected, offerings untouched. Athens, once radiant with festivals, processions, hymns, was now a city without prayer. Even the bells of the temples were stilled, replaced by the buzzing of flies. The silence of faith matched the silence of the houses. The city's streets bore witness to the breakdown. Corpses lay untended, gnawed by dogs, until even scavengers avoided them. Fires burned low, their ashes scattered by wind. The silence was not peace. It was dread, for every quiet street held behind its doors the echo of cries. Now ended, every shuttered window concealed a family gone. And you, walking through, felt the weight of their absence pressing upon you like a hand on your chest. The plague did not only kill, it unmade the city's spirit. The democracy that had flourished with debate now had no voice. The army that had marched with discipline now staggered with fever. The temples that had bound the city in reverence now stank of rot. What remained was silence, the silence of a city hollowed out. The silence of houses filled with unmoving forms. The silence of gods who gave no answer. And in that silence, you too stood still, a witness. You breathe, you see, you remember. The silent houses of Athens are never gone from your memory. They remain, sealed in stone, sealed in time, sealed in the pages of Thucydides, who wrote not with flourish but with the steady hand of one who saw, who endured, who survived, and now you too endure. The silence enters you, becomes part of you, so that even when the city lives again, you will not forget the quiet weight of the dead. The last bell. You remember when the bells stopped. Athens had always been a city of sound, the clang of blacksmiths, the cries of vendors, the chants of processions, and the solemn ringing of temple bells marking sacrifice and prayer. But now, as the plague consumed its third year, the bells fell silent. There was no one left to strike them, no one left to listen. Where once their sound had echoed across marble colonnades, now only the rasp of wind carried through. And in the hollow where sound had been, you heard only your own breath and the soft shifting of flies. The plague had not ended. It clung, wave upon wave. Thucydides describes its persistence. It lasted for no less than 3 years. Each season brought new fevers. Each summer reignited the flames. By now, Athens was a shadow of herself. Whole districts stood empty, their inhabitants gone. Others lingered, but thin, hollowed, fearful. The plague had spared some, but it had broken all. You recall walking through Keramikos, once filled with tombs of honored dead. Now the graves overflowed. The ground itself cracked open with hasty burials. Stone markers lay toppled, names forgotten before they were carved. The cemeteries had no order. They were not sanctuaries of memory, they were pits of necessity. The bells might have called men to arms, but there were too few left to answer. Sparta still stood across the land, but the city's defenders were diminished, not by spear or shield, but by fever. Pericles was gone, carried to his pyre like countless others. His death marked not only the loss of a leader but of the city's compass. Without him, Athens drifted, still at war. still building ships, but drained of her lifeblood. The democracy stumbled forward, its assemblies thinner, its debates muted, its laws disregarded. What argument could hold when death stalked every home? The last bell you heard was not in the Agora, nor the Acropolis, nor even the great temples. It was in a small shrine near the harbor. A priest, weak and coughing, had clung to ritual. He rang the bell, his voice hoarse with prayer, his body shaking with fever. The sound was thin, wavering, but it carried. For a moment, it seemed Athens still breathed with piety. But days later, you passed again, and the shrine was silent. The door open. Inside, the priest lay among his offerings, his bell fallen beside him. No hand had lifted it since. That silence was heavier than the plague itself. The survivors lived differently now. Some, having endured the sickness, moved with impunity, unafraid of touch or breath. Others still cowered, avoiding even shadows, fearing that the air itself carried death. Commerce dwindled to barter. Gold and silver, once hoarded, mattered little. Grain mattered, water mattered, survival mattered. The city of Pericles, once radiant with marble and art, was reduced to its most primal hungers. Beauty no longer stirred men. Only thirst, only hunger, only the absence of fever gave value. Faith, too, had dissolved. The temples, still swollen with corpses, bore witness to abandonment. Thucydides observed, the temples were full of the dead bodies of those who had died there. As people came in them to die, you still see it when you close your eyes. The columns darkened with soot, the floors slick with fluids, the altars buried beneath bodies. Priests were gone, sacrifices ceased. Men no longer looked to the heavens. They looked only to earth, to the dust where their kin lay, to the water jars from which they drank, to the fever that burned in their own blood. The gods were silent as the bells. And yet, life clung stubbornly. Children born during the plague sometimes survived, their cries thin but insistent. Farmers, when safe to leave the walls, planted again in ruined fields. Sailors still launched ships, though crews were small and fearful. Democracy staggered but did not die. Even as the plague tore at her flesh, Athens refused to collapse entirely. You saw men gathering in the assembly, their faces drawn, their voices hoarse, but still they argued, still they planned, still they dreamed of victory over Sparta. It was defiance, though perhaps it was madness. The most haunting silence came not from temples or assemblies, but from houses once full of laughter. You recall one in particular, a grand home near the Agora, once alive with symposiums, where men reclined on couches, drinking wine, debating philosophy. You had heard their laughter spill into the night. When the plague struck, the doors closed. For weeks, nothing stirred. Then one day, neighbors broke the lock. Inside they found couches overturned, cups scattered, a lyre on the floor. Around it lay the family, musicians, philosophers, children, all still. Their symposium ended forever. The house remained silent thereafter, its instruments rotting with its masters. That silence was heavier than any funeral chant. You remember too the bodies abandoned in fountains. The thirst of the plague was insatiable. Men threw themselves into cisterns, into public basins, into rivers. Some drowned, too weak to rise. Others died clutching the water they could not swallow. You saw fountains clogged with corpses, their waters red with rust and blood. Once, fountains had been places of laughter, of gossip, of life. Now they were graves. No bell rang for these men. No rites honored them. Only the splash of water disturbed their stillness. The plague finally loosened its grip. Not with ceremony, not with a cure, but slowly, as though it had tired of its feast. Survivors emerged, scarred but living. They spoke little of what had passed, for words could not contain it. Thucydides himself confessed that memory failed. that no description could equal the reality. Yet he wrote, so that Athens' suffering would not vanish into silence. You, too, bear witness. The silence you carry is not absence, it is memory. You recall the carts, the pyres, the temples swollen, the houses stilled. You recall the last bell, its sound thin and trembling, fading into air that no longer cared. Athens did not recover quickly. The scars remained long after the fever receded. War still consumed Greece. Trust in the gods remained shaken. Families were fewer, names erased. But from the silence, new voices rose. Children grew, survivors endured, and though the plague had silenced the bells, the city itself did not remain mute forever. Marble was still carved, ships still built, theaters still filled, eventually. Yet you know that beneath every stone, every word, every song, lies the silence of those years. A silence that waits, heavy and eternal. You are here, standing in that silence. You smell still the acrid smoke, the rot of temples, the stale air of houses never opened. You feel still the heat of carts burning themselves. You hear, in memory, the last thin bell, and you know, even when life resumes, even when voices rise again, that silence will always remain, echoing through time, carried by memory, carried by witness, carried by you. You remain standing among ruins that are not of stone, but of flesh and memory. The plague that came to Athens in 430 BC did not vanish quickly, it lingered, returning in waves, gnawing at the city for years. Thucydides, himself a survivor, recorded that the calamity was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would become of them, became careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. You know now what he meant, for you have walked those streets. You have inhaled that stench. You have seen the temples whose bellies held the dead. The Peloponnesian War did not cease while the plague raged. Sparta still pressed against Athens. Yet it was the unseen pestilence that brought the deeper wound. Tens of thousands died, among them, generals, priests, children, slaves, and Pericles himself, the leader who had dreamed of Athenian empire, who had adorned the Acropolis with marble and filled its theaters with art, perished like any other man, his voice silenced, his plans buried in ash. Athens, though still formidable in war, had lost something greater, her spirit. The plague unmade the city's foundations. Customs dissolved, law lost its grip, faith cracked, as the gods seemed absent in the very places once consecrated to them. Families crumbled, whole lineages extinguished. The pride of Athens, her democracy and discipline, her reverence for ritual, all faltered beneath the weight of fever and fire. The stones of the Parthenon still gleamed, but the people who had raised them lay rotting at its foot. And yet, some lived, scarred, blinded, limping, but alive. These survivors carried not only the marks on their bodies but the burden of memory. They became immune, but also became haunted. They tended others. They rebuilt. They remembered. Without them, there would be no Athens to speak of, no history preserved, no words of Thucydides to echo across time. It was survival at its most fragile, but it was survival nonetheless. You stand now in that fragile space. You recall the silent houses, the burning carts, the last bell. You recall the cries of thirst, the abandonment of rights, the collapse of faith, and you know that the meaning of the plague is not only in numbers, not only in corpses stacked in temples. Its meaning is in the reminder it leaves, that human greatness is brittle, that cities fall not only by sword but by sickness, that law and art and beauty can vanish when fever seizes the lungs. The plague of Athens is not gone. It waits, in memory, in history, in the words you now carry. You have borne witness, not as a tourist of time, but as one who has walked its streets, who has smelled its air, who has stood in its silence. The lesson is not comfort, but clarity. Power fades. Faith falters. Life ends swiftly, and yet, memory endures. Perhaps you pass by a fragment of stone, carved once with a name now unread. Perhaps you see a page in a library, its ink faded but still legible. These are the traces that remain. And as long as you remember, the voices of Athens' dead are not wholly silenced. They remain, not in temples swollen with corpses, but in the memory you carry forward. The past is not dead. It is only waiting.